Graveyard shift, everyone hates it, but someone always has to do it. Tonight it was me. I sat there, feet propped up on the counter, watching the empty pumps from the window. No one came through here usually past 12 o'clock. One of the reasons I liked working the night shift. It was always quiet. All I had to do was sit there and watch over things. How hard could that be? Accompanied by endless snacks and free food, I was practically being paid to sit around and do nothing. So I went on with my normal, usually routine, sitting there listening to the top 10 countdowns on the radio, gorging down some junk food and catering myself with energy drinks. Usually by 1 o'clock, I would start to feel the sugar buzz. That's when I would bring out the green for a little something extra. It was getting late, and the energy drinks had drowned themselves in my liver a little too fast. So I went off to relieve myself. There I was, zipping myself up in that filthy bathroom. I swear a dead body could be disposed there and no one would notice. I looked into the mirror and could see the bags underneath my eyes. After washing my hands with the brown water, I decided to use the lifter. So I pulled out a fresh batch and lit one up. Smoke filled the bathroom. I locked the bathroom up and vented it so the smoke would leave. That's when I saw a car was pulled up to one of the pumps. An old, worn-down Chevy, blacked out, so dark I couldn't see through it. I continued on inside slowly and walked to the counter, but I saw no one. I looked again outside through the windows, but there the car was parked at pump number 6. I turned towards the cameras and looked at the 4 screens that perimeter the gas station, but I saw nothing. No sign of anything. I walked outside, putting my hands in my pockets, and slowly edged towards the car. Step after step, slowly walking into the fluorescence. I walked towards the Chevy and felt a chill go down my spine. I could see long scratch marks along the car, ragged and deep. I walked closer to the car and peered into the driver's window, but could see nothing, pitch black. There was something in the back seat, though I couldn't tell what, but something was definitely there, in the midst of all that darkness. Then the bell rang from the inside of the gas station, nearly startling me. I let go of the stair and walked back to the store. I rounded the snacks, but no one was there. I called out to see if anyone was there, but no one. Instead, all that was left was $6 on the counter. I walked over to the cash register and no money had been taken out. I looked over at the window and saw the doors of the Chevy wide open. I looked back over to the security cameras and saw nothing. Another car drove up. It was the police, quite frankly. I was happy to see it. I stood at the counter as 2 policemen came into the store. They nodded, as did I. "That'll be $35.70, I said to one of the officers. They could tell I was shaken up. "You okay there, pal?" I wanted to tell them about the car and the 6 random dollars, but I was afraid they'd think I was lying, so I just nodded to the Chevy. It's been sitting there for 30 minutes and hasn't moved. No plates, no owner, and then when I came back in, I found this on the counter. I held up the $6. The officers looked at it, and one of them motioned to take a look at the car. I watched as one of the officers surfaced towards the blackened car. "So you work here all alone at night?" the officer asked. I nodded, trying to stay straight, trying to remember I was still pretty high. I watched intensively as the officer walked around the car, shined a flashlight at the open doors. He then turned away from the car and did a walk around the building. I still watched as his flashlight lagged in every camera. He finally came back in. I checked the car and the entire building, but nothing. Must be some kid or bum. I'd say stolen vehicle, but there's no plates, but whoever they are, they're gone now, the officer said. But in no way did I feel any relief. "It happens all the time, kid. Listen, we'll report it and it'll be towed by morning." I sighed, but I knew something was off. The abandoned car, whatever was inside, the change on the counter, something was off. "It's been pretty busy tonight." I tried to laugh with them. They just smirked. "Well, before we go off on our way, do you mind if I use the bathroom?" the officer who just came in asked. No, not at all. It's just around the corner outside. I really hoped the room was fully aired out by the time the officer would walk in there. So there I was, again with the other officer. 5 minutes passed by, then 10, then 15. He sure is taking a while, I questioned as the officer gave me a look, then turned into his shoulder to radio his partner. Officer Brown, this is Officer Keyes. Do you copy? There was a pause before he tried again. Officer Brown, this is Officer Keyes. Do you copy? No answer. I began to feel worried as Officer Keyes looked over at me. No response. Keyes motioned for me to come with him to check the bathroom. We both walked outside me again with my hands in my jacket and Keyes with his gun in his hands. I can't say this worrying was getting better by the second. Keyes led the way. We made it all the way to the door. Officer Brown, this is Officer Keyes. Do you copy? We could hear the echo of Officer Keyes' voice come from the bathroom, both preparing for what to expect. Officer Keyes motioned for me to get back as he pried the door open, and what I saw brought me to my knees as I threw up. Officer Keyes just covered his mouth, then gagged. There was blood everywhere on the walls, painting the tiles of the bathroom with handprints and smeared bloodstains, and in the middle of all it there it was, the radio that belonged to Officer Brown. Keyes quickly ran inside, then picked it up, hustling me back towards the store. Jesus, what the hell could have done that? I started to worry and scream as Keyes sat there. The police radio crackled with static, and Officer Keyes exchanged a grim glance with me. We need backup, he muttered into the radio, his voice tense. The atmosphere in the gas station shifted from an eerie quiet to a palpable fear. As we waited for backup, Officer Keyes secured the crime scene, cautioning me to stay inside. I couldn't shake the image of the blood-soaked bathroom from my mind. The minutes dragged on, each second amplifying the sense of dread. Backup arrived, and the gas station was soon swarming with officers. They combed through the area, searching for any trace of Officer Brown or the perpetrator. Questions were fired at me, and I recounted the bizarre events of the night. Amidst the chaos, a detective approached me, his expression grave. "We'll investigate this thoroughly. You did the right thing by reporting it," he assured, but his words offered little comfort. The gas station, once a haven of solitude, now buzzed with a different kind of energy, one tainted by an unsettling mystery. The officers took statements, gathered evidence, and towed away the mysterious Chevy. As dawn approached, casting an eerie light over the gas station, I couldn't shake the feeling that something darker lurked beneath the surface. The graveyard shift had transformed into a nightmarish ordeal, leaving me to grapple with the lingering questions and the chilling unknown. The detective thanked me for my cooperation, and as the police presence dwindled, I was left alone in the gas station once more. The sunrise painted the sky in hues of orange, but the shadows of the night's events lingered. I resumed my post behind the counter, haunted by the events that unfolded during that fateful graveyard shift. The gas station, once a haven of solitude, now stood as a silent witness to a mystery that remained unsolved. All right, let me just try to recall this as best as I can. It happened a while back, and I try not to think about it more than I have to. For starters, I used to work in a gas station, but the title made that obvious enough, I guess. It wasn't a place in the middle of the city, but it wasn't way out in the countryside either. It was one of those awkward, in-between areas where mostly it's just low-end houses, fast food joints, and gas stations like the one that hired me. The station was on a 2-lane road that wasn't far from a major highway, and we got a lot of people stopping in for gas who were on their way to the beach for the weekend or just passing through on their way to the cities around us. Typical of any gas station like the one I worked at, if I do say so myself. But you see, that was during normal hours. Once the sun went down, oh, that was when the fun really started. That was when all the freaks showed up. Late at night, all the shadier customers would show their repulsive faces. Drunks would stumble through the doors and keep on going right for the back wall, where we kept all the alcohol. Teenagers would slink in, trying to buy cigarettes. I'd ID all of them, and some of the cards they showed me looked fake, some didn't. To be honest with you, I didn't really care. If they wanted to wreck their health, it was their business. Potheads would wander in too and load up on chips and ice cream. Oh God, the ones who would buy ice cream were a funny bunch. More often than not, they'd ask for a spoon with their ice cream, and we only had the crappy plastic kind. I had one idiot stand there for 20 minutes trying to scoop the desert into his mouth with one of those bendy spoons. One time, a guy shoplifted the store right in front of me around midnight. Then he walked outside, called the cops on himself, and just stood there in the parking area waiting for them to show up. I had followed him outside, and I asked him what his deal was. He looked at me and said that he just wanted a place to sleep for the night. I hadn't expected that, but I told him that if he wanted to sell the story, then he should keep running. That he did. He walked off the property and down the small road. I heard sirens not long after. But I suppose I should tell you about the big one, the fucker who made me quit that job. I have a tendency to ramble, and like I said, I try not to think too much about this guy. It was another graveyard shift, another night of my life spent behind a cheap wooden counter. I was pissing my life away, but I was doing it for some money, so it was all good, and I was better off than most of the people who walked through those doors anyway. It was 2:20 a.m. or so. I remember staring at the clock in boredom, watching the 2 dots of the display tick on and off as it counted the seconds. That was when I heard the bell over the door, and I looked up to gauge the person who had just stepped into my little world. He was only a little over 5 feet tall and looked like he could be 50 years old, easily. His skin was rough and saggy. His arms and legs were dotted all over with tiny white hairs, matched by equally white hair, which hung down in long reams from his head. It was scraggly and matted together. You know how hair gets if you don't take a shower for like 2 days? This guy looked like he'd spent 2 weeks without the good graces of any shampoo. He slowly walked his way over to the counter mechanically, like each step was a deliberate action. Finally, he made it over to me, and he thumped his hands onto the counter for support. His hands were crisscrossed with varicose veins. They looked like cracks in broken glass. Lines of black grit ran underneath the edges of his fingernails. He finally opened his mouth to speak and gave me a good view of his slimy yellow teeth. Fucking disgusting. He asked in a croaky voice where our bathroom was, and I just pointed sternly toward the back corner of the room. There was a little hallway which held doors to the storage rooms and one small bathroom. He lumbered off in that general direction, and I silently thanked God that weirdo was out of my face. I heard the door click shut. Once again, I was by myself for the most part. The station was silent for 5 minutes, then 10, 15. It started to get weird how long this guy was taking in the bathroom. If this were a normal-looking guy, I wouldn't have questioned it, but the man in there was anything but normal. At the 20-minute mark, I journeyed out from behind my counter and toward the bathroom. I knocked on the door a couple times and asked if the guy needed any help. I heard him mumble from the other side that he was fine, but he didn't sound all that fine to me. I wasn't about to argue with him, though, so I just walked back over to the counter and sat down in my chair. Another 10 minutes went by, and that guy still hadn't come out of the bathroom. I was getting agitated at that point. Eventually, I started hearing a noise. At first, I couldn't really tell what it was, but it didn't take long to figure it out. I was hearing moaning. I started walking back to the bathroom once again. This time, I could tell as I neared the door that something definitely wasn't right. It sounded like the man was in pain, maybe even afraid. Sheepishly, I knocked on the door once again, and for a while I didn't get a response. But eventually the man managed to choke out 2 simple words, "Help me." His moaning was getting louder and turning to yelling. I started hearing banging coming from inside the bathroom. I could even feel it shake the floor just a little. I went for the knob, but of course the man had locked himself into the bathroom and hadn't gotten around to actually trying unlock it. I was panicking a little. I didn't know if this was just a bad case of the runs or something like that, or if it was something more serious. I started to think that the latter was true, but there was a rancid stench that was beginning to make its way out of that damn bathroom. It could have just been some horrible diarrhea, I thought. I shuddered a little bit at that. I shouted at him to open the door. He had to unlock it if he wanted help, of course, but he wasn't listening to me. He had started babbling some incoherent nonsense about how he had to keep the door locked because he was only safe in that room. They were coming for him, he said. I kept shouting at him to unlock the door, but he was off on a horrible tangent about how they were coming for him and how they had finally figured him out. All the while, his slurred speech was punctuated by cries for help. He just kept shouting for help. I kept hearing banging. I was freaked out, and in that moment I didn't figure I had the time to call the cops or anything like that. The man's speech was trailing off, and he sounded like he was in a very bad way. I'd like to say that I didn't freak out, that I knew what to do, and handled the situation in a respectable way. But I did none of that. I spent the next probably 5 minutes pacing in that little hallway, my hands pressed to my head in desperation while I tried to think of something, anything, to do. The man's yelling and flailing had stopped, I noticed, and I was desperate to do something. Finally, I was struck with inspiration. I went into the storage room next to me, and I grabbed a rolling dolly that we used to move some of the heavier crates around. Then I rushed back into the hallway, and with all the force I could muster, which must have been a lot thanks to adrenaline, I bashed the door wide open. The smell that hit me almost made me throw up right then and there. I dropped the rolling dolly and stumbled away from the room, gagging. I almost fell over, but I steadied myself on a wine shelf. I had to take a moment to catch myself, and it felt like I was going insane. It really struck me then that I needed outside help. So I did what any sensible person would have done a while back. I called the police. I assumed the worst. In the moment I saw the man, it had looked like he was certainly dead. He was sprawled out on the tile floor, half-heartedly resting against the wall. His back was slumped down, curving in the space between the wall and the floor. His knuckles were very bloody, and pockmarks in the wall, which were also licked with blood, made it fairly obvious he'd been punching around. It was obvious enough where the smell was coming from. That bastard was sitting in a putrid film of brown liquid. Yes, he'd shit himself. He wasn't even on the toilet, for Christ's sake. Fucking hell. I was still on the line with the police. I did my best to describe the scene to them. As much as I really didn't want to know what had happened to that guy in the bathroom, I figured he could still need help. I announced to the operator that I was going back in. I held out hope that he was alive, but feared otherwise. I guess I really went back into that hallway just out of morbid curiosity more than anything else. I had to pull up my shirt and cover my face with it to keep the smell from overpowering me. It didn't do too much to help. The guy had a yellowish powder all around his nose and his mouth, as well as a little froth at the corners of his lips. His eyes were bloodshot and glazed over. I said to the operator that it looked like he'd overdosed on some drug. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go outside for some fresh air. I was groggy and mortified and depressed. A man had just died next to me, for God's sake. At the most, I was out there for 5 minutes. I could already hear sirens when I stepped into the cool night breeze. Only 5 minutes. But here's the thing, here's what really messed me up bad. When the police arrived, they asked me to show them where the incident had occurred. An ambulance was there as well, and the paramedics were getting their equipment. I led them all to the back, and it still smelled horrible. There were still punch marks on the wall, and there was still some of that drug powder dusted around the floor. but the man who'd been laying there was gone. He was just fucking gone, like he hadn't even been there. I don't mean he was gone in the sense that he got up and left. There weren't any boot prints, no streaks of liquid on the floor, no hand prints on the walls. There was none of that. It was like he just vanished. I can't explain it. I don't want to know what happened that night. I quit a few days later. I couldn't keep going back there, not after all that. You know, the things that guy said keep replaying in my head. All those things about how they were coming for him. God help me. I worked at a gas station full-time for some years in my 30s during my last few months working. There I noticed this guy would come in every few days. In my opinion, he was very obviously a druggie, always coming in and looking like he'd been up for 3 days straight. He'd look around all paranoid and would grab a few things to eat, then would rush out and drive away. He always paid in cash and would have exact change ready to go to make the interaction quicker. He never spoke a word. He got in and got out as fast as possible. I never really thought too much of it because he seemed harmless enough. The only person he looked like he was hurting was himself with his drug addiction. But then one night he was acting differently. He came in at 2 a.m., but he was pacing around the store, just walking around frantically after a couple minutes. It became more strange because he'd never stayed inside the store for this long. I glanced outside at the gas station lot and didn't see any cars where our gas station was located. Made it nearly impossible to walk to, or at least very impractical. I looked back at the guy and he was still pacing around. "Hey, are you all right? You want me to call someone to pick you up?" I asked, just trying to help. He stopped and shot a look at me. His eyes were dark and sleepless. Then he rushed out of the store and I watched him walk past the pumps and over to the road until he was out of sight. The guy was weird and all, but even this was a little extra from him. That night went by without anything else. But the following night, the same thing happened. He came in, paced around, then rushed away as soon as I asked if he needed anything. I was honestly concerned for him until the next night, when he came in and was acting normal again. He got some food and paid in cash, then left just like he always used to do after that visit. A week went by without him coming in. I was working the register on a quiet Wednesday night, and I'd mostly forgotten about his strange behavior from last week. When he came back, he drove up in his truck and parked, then walked through the door slowly and stopped in the middle of the store. He looked to have this blank expression on his face, like he was in a state of shock. It's also worth mentioning that he looked extra tired. He stood for a moment, then walked to the food aisle. I tried not to spy on him too much, but he stayed in the store for almost 10 minutes before coming up to the counter. He still had that blank look in his eyes as he slowly put a small bag of chips down and handed me cash. It was very different from usual because he was in no rush. He actually seemed to be purposefully moving slowly. Once I rang up his food, he grabbed it, and in an unexpected moment, he quietly said, "Thank you." I'd seen this guy for months, and this was the first time he'd ever spoken a single word. I watched him walk out to his truck, but he stopped right by the door. A brief moment passed before I looked over and saw 4 men running up to him. They grabbed him aggressively, dragging him across the gas station and tossed him in their van. And just like that, they took off, leaving nothing but his truck sitting in the parking lot. When the police got there, they ran the plates, but the truck belonged to someone else, turned out. It belonged to his dad, who identified the guy when he was shown the security tapes. Other than that, nothing else was found. None of the people from the van were ever identified, and no traces of him were left. He never turned up, and if I had to take a guess from what I saw, he probably never will.